Hey guys, welcome back to the Bulwark. I am Sam Stein, managing editor at the site. I'm joined by Frank Sharry, longtime immigration reform advocate, has held many hats. The most recent one, I believe, would be advisor to the Kamala Harris campaign on immigration policy. Is that right, Frank?
That's right.
Do you want to state any of your other credentials, or is that good enough?
I worked on immigrants' rights and immigration reform for 40 years. That's my one
40
credential.
years. Oh my God.
40 years.
Thought you were only 45 years old. All right. Frank's out with a new piece today. It's a talker, as they say in the business. How Democrats lost their way on immigration. It's in the Atlantic. He co-authored it with Cecilia Munoz, a longtime fellow advocate in that space, worked for the Obama administration on immigration policy. I guess I have to start with well, let's start with the premise of the piece, which is that Democrats have lost touch with popular opinion on immigration, predominantly by moving left away from a more balanced approach, which was enforcement exchange for pathways to citizenship. We can get into the specifics of this in just a second, but my first question is, why did you decide to write this now?
Well, we've been concerned about the direction of the pro-immigrant movement for many years, Cecilia and I, and we've been very concerned that Democrats have allowed themselves to get defined by Republicans on this issue. And in the aftermath of the election, when there's a necessary, if painful, conversation among Democrats about which way forward now, we looked around and said, there's really no one else who's going to write this story.
Right.
About, from a relatively speaking insider perspective, on how we slowly but surely went from being in command of the issue 10 years ago to being under the boot of Trump and Trumpism on the issue. And that's an alarming progression on immigration. And obviously it's had a huge impact. I mean, a lot of the post-mortem polling showed that immigration was the issue that helped Trump the most and hurt Kamala Harris the most.
Right.
And so we just said, there's lots to say about policy and specifics, but as a branding exercise, as a narrative exercise, Democrats went from being, we're for the solution in a balanced way that won 3/4 of the public's backing, to we're not so sure we're even for enforcement. And if we are, it's kind of an afterthought. And most of the country said, we'd rather take a chance on a radical racist on immigration than go with Democrats because they seem so squishy on the issue.
Now, the piece is really it's both a look at the politics of immigration. It's also sort of a historical look at how we got to this place, starting in 2012 or a little bit before 2012. And I came away reading it thinking that sort of this great kind of ground zero moment was John Boehner's decision not to take up the Senate bill, the Senate Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill that had passed fairly convincingly in the Senate in 2013. And when John Boehner did that, John Boehner being the House Speaker at the time, it forced a questioning and a reckoning within the immigration reform community about what the next step would be. Can you talk a little bit about that moment and how that kind of led to where we are right now?
Yeah, well, so a bill passes the Senate on a bipartisan basis, 68-32. Not only the John McCain's of the world, but Marco Rubio.
Marco Rubio. Yeah, he helped write it.
Yeah, for a couple of weeks before he checked his polling in New Hampshire. I think he was a strong supporter of it.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, now, we knew we were going to have a tough time in the House. Boehner wanted to do it. He was kind of a Chamber of Commerce Republican who saw this as a good thing. And he had the Freedom Caucus saying, over our dead bodies, and Stephen Miller egging them on from his position as a Jeff Sessions staffer. Boehner, he hired a McCain staffer. He tried to make it happen. But at the end of the day, he was told by the Freedom Caucus, if you move this without having a majority of the caucus in favor of it, the so-called Hastert rule, if you really want to go back in the day, then we're gonna make sure you lose your job. And he didn't go forward. He lost his job anyway. He wrote in his autobiography that it was one of his most, it was one of the things he most regretted. some experts have said it was an appalling lack of political leadership. The votes were there. He just didn't have, it would have been about 40 to 45% of the Republicans voting for it and all the Democrats voting for it.
Right.
Now the reason they said they didn't want to vote for it was because Obama wasn't strong enough on enforcement. Right. Obama was known as the deporter in chief at the time because he was deporting more people than any president in history.
Right.
Just to show what bad faith there was.
But it also put your side in a weird position because you had tried to do this comprehensive reform and had not moved the ball. And then a bunch of advocates were like, well, look, if they're not going to do the balanced approach, screw them. Let's just pursue our priorities.
And so they did push. We all pushed very hard for executive action, which Obama took. The problem with executive action, particularly on an area like immigration, where it's quite clear in the Constitution that Congress has the authority to make immigration laws, that you find a Republican judge to stop stuff. And that's what Ken Paxton and his fellow AGs have done. And so Obama did a huge executive action that would have legalized about over 5 million people, and it was stopped in the court. So executive action sounds good because you don't have to get Republicans to vote for it, but it's unsustainable if you don't have an act of Congress or a friendly court. So what it led to was increasing frustration by advocates with Democrats. And so they turned on Democrats and said, you have power that you're not using, figure it out. And many meetings with Obama, with groups of us, like a constitutional law professor going, you say I have power. That's point.
I don't. Yeah,
I know something about constitution here, guys. We'll give it a try, but it's going to be hard. So what that led to was one, two things happened. The activists said, let's stop this negotiating from a position of a centrist balance. And for Republicans, it was, let's not give Democrats any win, because giving them any win will depress our base. And it was what you could say the beginning of the Freedom Caucus becoming the Trumpian base.
Well, what is the alternative here if you're an activist who believes in immigration reform? We've tried it one way. It's clear the Republicans are not going to support it, won't even bring it up for a vote. Where do you go? What are the other steps there? I mean, the alternative, it seems that you're suggesting, is just stay committed to the idea of something more comprehensive. Hopefully you elect some more Democrats and you find the right time.
But look, I don't think comprehensive or any kind of immigration reform is going to pass anytime soon.
Sure.
So I'm not here to say if we just push this button or that button. Yeah. What I'm saying is, as a political matter, it is a huge problem that Democrats let this issue become a loser.
Right.
Let's just stop there. If Democrats had stayed with the basic, look, we haven't gotten it across the finish line yet. Republicans are hurting us, but we're for solutions. We're for enforcement. We're for legalization. We're for more immigration. We're going to stay with it and continue to win the argument and marginalize Republicans as the radicals who oppose solutions. It would have been a lot easier in this election for Kamala Harris to say they block even a bipartisan border bill.
Right. Well, but Frank, she did say. I mean, we'll get to that.
I understand.
But
but it was years of branding of the Democrats as being open borders without. Well,
let's talk about the branding, because you did mention in the piece two things. One was the 2020 primary, where everyone raises their hand, or 8 of the 10 raise their hand, and they say we want to decriminalize border crossings. That turned out to be not so smart. The other thing, though, is which I thought was really actually more interesting, was Kay Hagan, former senator from North Carolina. She passed a few years back. She's in this tight race. It's 2014, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
2014.
Yeah, she gets heckled by immigration reform advocates for what was the crime that she had committed? She had been pro-enforcement.
She did not pressure Obama to act before the midterms.
Okay, and so they heckle her at an event. She goes on and loses the election. That, to me, you didn't say it in your piece, but it was like cutting your nose to spite your face, right? You lose a vote that you need on your side because you want purity from your side. Is that the problem here, in essence? That
is the problem.
Okay.
I mean, the fact is that most activists don't want to talk to Republicans because they know they're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
are not going to talk the same language. So they only talk to Democrats and pressure them from the left. And many Democrats either go with them or stay more silent than they would be otherwise because they don't want to anger a bunch of groups that have access to the press and do demonstrations in front of their offices. Or they go rogue, which many Senate Democrats did in 2022 when they were up in tight races. Every single one of them said, we don't like that Biden is not being clearer or stronger at the border.
Right.
And they had to distinguish their brand from the Biden and the Democratic brand. So, yeah, I just think that, look, Democrats have decided two things. One, let's not take on the groups directly. And two, let's not talk about this issue as much. And those combined have been
I want to get back to the groups because you're part. I mean, well, let's talk about the groups. You ran a group. People think that the groups are the problem. Is that a fair assessment? Were the groups the problem, or was it something more broad? Was it something broader than that?
The main point of this piece is actually to talk to Democrats. Advocacy groups are going to advocate, Sam. I know a lot about this, and there's going to be there's more of a spectrum than people call the groups. There's right. We built a lot of unity around immigration reform in 2013, 2014.
I mean, you had everybody. You had unions, you had immigration reform advocates, you had some business groups. I mean, that was a coalition right there, and it didn't work.
It was. And, now we don't. We have activist groups that are loud but not large, that don't speak for a lot of voters, and that the main impact is to either scare Democrats into silence or to encourage those who say things that aren't particularly helpful from a branding point of view. So, I mean, honestly, why did President Biden and the White House decide to deal with a huge surge of arrivals at the border by mainly going silent?
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the main reasons is they wanted to talk about other things that were more popular. But the other reason was why anger a bunch of groups who are going to, criticize us and maybe hurt us with progressives. And the point is that I think the groups that are most influential are the groups that work with the party that wants to do what you want to do, to find a way forward, to actually take on their opponents, and to build enough unity where the leaders have support. That's what we did with, Kennedy and McCain back in the day, and even with Obama when it was somewhat controversial. So I do think that groups bear some responsibility, but our audience in this is, look, Democrats, don't be afraid of the groups. Don't be silent on an issue that's the number 2 issue in the election.
Right.
And don't lean in only 6 months before the election.
Right. Let's get to Biden's record here because, they said this ad nauseum, right? The first bill he introduced when he took office was the U.S. Citizenship Act. It was a balanced approach to immigration, so on and so forth. I think it's fair, Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, to say that was kind of window dressing. They didn't push for it. They didn't really do much around it. They wanted to be able to say, hey, we put out a bill. And I would say, and with all respect to Vice President Harris, I mean, when they deputized her to deal with migration from the Triangle countries, it was more or less trying to offload something that they thought was politically dicey to get it away from the Oval. Is that an unfair reading?
Your reading on the bill, I think it was much more of a message bill to progressives that we see you, we hear you, we're with you. I actually think it's a bit more complicated, the Kamala Harris appointment to deal with. I think Biden was very proud of his record doing the same job with Obama. I think he thought it was a good idea.
Okay. Okay.
It didn't turn out that way.
It did not turn out that way.
He actually has a very successful record on it, but no one cares about the successful record because she herself was defined in that first year as someone who was being.
What should they have done in that first year when the numbers were surging? First 2 years when the numbers were surging. Obviously, the pandemic was on top of mind. And then as the jobs kind of came back, that was driving some of the immigration or the migration to the border. Like, what should they have done?
I actually think that the Biden policy agenda got it right at year 3.5.
Right.
I'm not sure they could have done it that much earlier. I know there's why didn't you do it earlier? It's not like they had some magic wand that they were holding back.
Well, hold
Together.
on. There was executive actions, right? I mean, in
They
theory, they
took
could have taken them earlier.
122 executive actions. They were taking action. Sam, the part that's missing in this is that
Yeah,
there's a huge surge of post-pandemic migration across the
right,
world. People are
right,
leaving their countries because they want a better life. And asylum is sort of a side door that they can use to get into Western countries. It's everywhere.
right,
And so it's not easy to, if you're going to follow the law of giving everyone an individualized asylum hearing, you're going to have this problem. And they finally decided in year 3.5, forget it. We're going to go right to the tippy tip end of what the law allows. And we're going to be very tough on people who use asylum to get in because they want to get work permits and stay in America, not because they really have a strong asylum claim. So they got much tougher in year 4.
and the
Could they have gotten
numbers,
tougher
yeah,
in year 2? I mean, looking back, yeah, maybe. But I think, look, I do think that this is one of the, I've been advising the Labour government in the UK. They're dealing with the same thing. They've got boats that smugglers bring from France into southeastern, and it drives the public crazy. And they're trying to deal with it within the contours of the law, but at the same time exert control. So I'm sympathetic to the challenge that the Biden administration faced. I think they finally got the policy right. They never got the politics right. They shouldn't have gone silent. They should have leaned in and said, "This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're," and instead of ceding the center to the Biden border crisis mantra of the Republicans, they should have said, "This is what we're up against. This is what we're dealing with. This is what we're inherited." And they just said, "Let's go silent and hope that we don't have a headline today."
and yeah, so they were trying to avoid pissing off people in their own tent. I want to end with the politics because that's, I mean, to me, this is not just an issue with immigration policy, but it's basically everywhere for Democrats right now, which is you have one person in Donald Trump who deals in absolutes and will say every solution. He has the answer to every problem, and it's a very basic solution: deport people, tariffs. Like it's just one word, and he can. And the remedy that you and Cecilia argue in this piece in the Atlantic is that you have to be forceful in advocating that you have a more balanced solution. So you are pro-enforcement, but in a sensible way. You are for getting border security, but also with some humanity. And I just want to challenge whether that works in an era like this, where people just want blunt, hard, politics, and Trump will give them exactly the kind of thrill and that emotional zest that they crave. Like if I were an uninformed voter, I think I would say, yeah, kick them all out versus, well, kick some out and let's get some pathways and nuance works.
If I hadn't lived this experience for many years, it was pre-Trump. I agree. Trump's
different.
Yeah, he's different. But what I can speak to is what Democrats should say.
Sure.
They can say, we're just going to be like Trump.
No one's
unacceptable morally and stupid politically.
Yeah.
They can say, we're going to be the opposite of Trump and try to let as many people in as possible. We tried that de facto. Didn't work. When we did before Trump, say, you know what? We have a bipartisan solution that combines enforcement and legal pathways in a way that works. See, it's not just a messaging framework. Right. It's a policy framework. When you have, this is what Biden did, when you have legal pathways from high out migration nations combined with tough restrictions at the border for illegal border crossings, people apply through an orderly process.
Right. I guess people were, but the truth of the matter is that people really looked back at the Obama era, back to Obama, and thought he just took it too far, right? The deportations, the restrictions at the border, they were really angry with him laying the predicate for what Trump ended up doing. Now, obviously, it wasn't a family separation, but he had people in cages. Let's be honest about it.
I understand, but the fact is that you're either for enforcement or you're not. And right. So if every enforcement measure is just like Trump, well, then you have, I mean, that's a bad faith argument in my view.
Sure.
You're not making it, but that's the argument we hear all the time. Yeah. So, should we have border security? Duh. Should we crack down on unscrupulous employers who exploit immigrant workers to undercut American competitors and American workers? Duh. Should we go after immigrants who have committed crimes and are a public safety threat? Yes. I mean, so it's not a problem saying these things,
Right.
but it became a problem saying these things. So Obama did have sensible now his deportation policies were excessive. He didn't get the balance right in terms of governance and messaging. And so
Yeah.
from my point of view, it was excessive. But at least it was in the direction of how do we do this so that we can be not just credible, but effective on there are limits that we are going to enforce at the same time, because that creates political space as well as public confidence in expanded legal pathways. It really does work together. So when you have the public saying, those guys are minding the store, we want to let in more people legally, yeah, that works. When you have people saying they're not minding the store, there's an invasion, as the Republicans called it, and a lot of people are coming in illegally, and and the Biden administration seems clueless or indifferent. Right. And then they say, well, let's do this other good immigration stuff. They say, hell no, let's deport them. Yeah. And so it is a delicate balance, and I understand it's difficult to understand.
Do you think Trump will over-torque like he did the first time around, and then give Democrats an opportunity?
Of course he will. He will go too far. And because what the public wants is not mass deportation. I know there's some polling that says, well, maybe. What they're saying is do something. Right. But what people want, people aren't anti-immigrant, they're anti-chaos. And that's what hurt Biden. And Trump thinks they're anti-immigrant, and they're not. And so when he creates the chaos by deporting mixed status families or going into churches or whatever.
And how would you advise Democrats' message around if let's assume he goes through with the deportations as Stephen Miller has outlined them?
Yeah, okay? Well, they should. I mean, so if they're deporting people who have been convicted of crimes, they should not raise a ruckus about it. If they are deporting rooted families who are dreamers or are essential workers or farm workers who have been here for years and have otherwise obeyed the law, they should raise holy hell and say, this is not what America is about. We should be legalizing these people. So you have to, what I want Democrats to do is say, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. Trump's the wrong way. We have the right way. But the right way has to strike that balance in a way that's credible, that's operational, that you can govern that way. And that's the alignment of policy and politics that got out of whack in the last few years. The groups had something to do with it. Biden had a lot to do with it politically. And his team figured it out policy, and it was too little too late.
All right, we can end it there. Frank, as always, a real pleasure. I'm glad that we did this after the UConn-Gonzaga game and not during the Maui Invitational, because that would have been a different, more depressing conversation. I recommend everyone read the piece, How Democrats Lost Their Way on Immigration. It's a fantastic piece. The only problem with it was it did not appear in the Bulwark. He decided to put it in the Atlantic, but we won't hold that against Frank. Frank Sharry, thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. Go Huskies.